The other day, I was pulling out onto Apopka Vineland Road, and a car pulled up alongside of me, and I looked over, and what do you suppose the driver was doing? Texting while driving. I see this a lot, and anytime I see it, I try to not be in front of them, especially if we're approaching a stoplight, because I don't want to be the one that gets to experience the rear ending if they have, totally missed the thing that the light's turning colors. But it's not just while the vehicle's moving. I'm assuming that most of you that drive have been sitting at a stoplight behind a car that's behind a bunch of other cars that have already gone through the light. And in Orlando, we're pretty horn happy, so usually somebody lets them know. But right, same thing, distracted, texting, paying attention to that instead of to what's going on around you. Now, some of you can't text. Some of you aren't old enough to drive. But for those of you that can text and drive, this is something that happens, right? We have laws about these things. A few years ago, one of my boys saw a study or some explanation as to why people text when they drive. And the answer was that while all of us would say, yeah, that's not a good idea, but when I do it, I'm an excellent driver, and I pay very good attention while I text. So I can do it and not be dangerous. It's all the rest of you that when you text and drive, it's bad. I share all of this because we hear a passage from 1 Corinthians today where Paul is talking to the Corinthians about something that I think is roughly the equivalent of texting while driving. Paul starts off by comparing the people of Israel to the Corinthians. And so he looks back to the time of Exodus when they came through the Red Sea and they were led by a pillar of cloud and a pillar of fire. Clouds are, what are they made of? Water, and they went through the Red Sea. So he ties that experience to baptism. And then in the wilderness, they were fed by manna, and they were fed by water that come out of a rock. And so Paul ties that to communion and says that the people of Israel, as they were traveling through the wilderness, right, they had something equivalent to baptism and spiritual food in the same way that the Corinthians do. So having connected them to the people of Exodus, he then has some warnings for them. And the first one is that they not worship idols. And this points back to one of my favorite stories in Scripture. If you pay attention to the relationship between Moses and Joshua, Moses is actually quite intentional about the ways that he raises Joshua up as a leader. He invites Joshua into situations where Joshua can see what Moses has to deal with, and then he helps Joshua think through what he's seen. So in the 24th chapter of Exodus, and the chapters of Exodus are kind of long, Moses goes up with some elders, and they have a meeting, and then he goes up on the mountain by himself to have a conversation with God. And that then goes through chapter 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, and into chapter 32. So Moses is up there for a long time, receiving from God all of this stuff about the law and the tabernacle they're supposed to build and all of the details of it. And while he's up there, the people who've been following Moses through the wilderness at some point go, hey, what happened to Moses? He's been gone for a pretty long time. And then they turn to his brother Aaron the priest and say, I don't think he's coming back. Can you make us an idol? So Moses being gone causes them to lose sight of how God has been providing for them and leading them through the wilderness. And their first move is to worship something else. So Aaron melts down all their gold and makes a golden calf. About this time, Moses comes down and grabs Joshua on the way down the mountain, and they can hear a big, loud sound. And this is where Joshua is still learning. And he says, oh no, there's a war in the camp. And Moses shakes his head and says, nope, that's a party, and not a good one. And they come down and discover all this idol worship that's happening, and then it goes very bad after that. And this is what Paul is saying is, do you remember when they lost sight of God and started to worship something else? It did not go well. So then he provides three more examples to the Corinthians. He says also, you remember when sexual immorality was a problem? That's really also, though, it's pointing to a story about idol worship. Because in the Hebrew Scriptures, when the prophets got all fired up about idol worship, it was usually because the people were worshiping the god Baal and participated in these fertility sacrifices in the temple and in the holy places of Baal. So that is also a way for Paul to say, again, when you worship idols, things don't go well. Then the other two examples is, he says they tested Christ in the desert. So Paul puts the testing that they have of God in the desert and just says that was also Jesus. And then he says they complained a lot. And so he's pointing back and saying, if we lose sight of how God is providing for us and try to test God, or if we just complain about it all the time, usually that doesn't go well. So why is Paul sharing all of this? Well, if you read the bits that come before what we heard today and what comes after it, all of the bits before are about eating food sacrificed to idols. And as soon as we get past the passage for today, he says, so don't go sacrificing and eating food sacrificed to idols, right? So somehow all of this is wrapped up in how the Corinthians, like the people of Israel, sometimes lost sight of God and started to put their hope and trust in idols. He says to them, and this is where it's like texting while driving, he says, so you think you are standing, and they would go to these, right? They would have communion at church, but then they would go to these pagan sacrifices where we hear about it in the gospel, where they're mixing the blood of sacrifices. And Paul says, like, those are demons that you are hanging out with in those pagan sacrifice places. So then when he says, in today's passage, he says, so when you think you are standing, be careful that you don't fall. And I think what he's saying is, I know you think you can text while you're driving, and you might get away with it for a while, but if you keep doing it, sooner or later, it's going to go badly. He's saying to the Corinthians, I know you think you can go hang out with people that are worshiping other gods and participate in all of their sacrifices and do all of this stuff. Sooner or later, that's not going to go well for you. Well, how does that translate to our life today? I don't think this is a caution for hanging out in interreligious spaces, right? We have a fantastic relationship with the mosque down the street, and I think that's wonderful, right? We're all people of faith journeying together. I think it's about where we put our hope and our trust. Now, we have not yet, as a congregation, melted down all of our gold and made an idol, at least not since I've been here. We won't necessarily do it the way that the Corinthians were cautioned against the way the people of Israel did. But Luther said that a God is where we put our trust, our ultimate trust. So just like the Corinthians and just like the people of Israel, sometimes we lose sight of God. And if we lose sight of God, we can put our trust in other places. There's lots of ways we do that. Luther would suggest that primarily it's in ourselves and in wealth. But there are plenty of other people that come along and suggest that they can make things better for us, right? Every time we have an election, there's promises that this one is going to be the one that solves all the problems. We've got self-help books and billboards and all kinds of things that will tell us just how to get better. And it's easy sometimes with all of that messaging to follow that. So Paul says, you think you can text while you're driving, but you probably can't, even if you get away with it for a little while. And then we can hear that same caution, right? But then there's more at the end of this text, which actually gets to our question about why God allows bad things. It actually says, God will not allow you to be tested, Paul says, beyond what you can endure. He notes that everybody gets tested, and then says that God will always provide a way out. Now, I have struggled with this passage. Part of the question of why do bad things happen is because we have free will. If we didn't have free will, we could just be robots. But since we have free will, then we can choose good or bad. And God has to work with what we choose. And God tends to show up in that suffering. But when I hear this passage that says, God will not test you beyond what you can bear, I look around and say, gosh, I've seen some people get tested beyond what they can bear. So what am I supposed to do with that when Paul is telling me that God will not test you beyond what you can bear? And that's where it's important to remember that this whole thing is wrapped up in Paul's concern about idol worship. I think what Paul is saying is, if you trust in God, and that is where your hope is, imperfect as that trust may be, God is not going to test you more than you can bear. But if you continue to text while you're driving and put your trust in other places, those places will ultimately test you more than you can bear. Have any of you ever lost sight of taking care of yourself and just kept going and going and going until you just collapsed and had nothing left? Maybe ended up in the hospital or mental health issues, whatever else happens when we run ourselves into the ground. Can we test ourselves more than we can bear? We can. Have any of you ever had a job that just kept asking for more and more and more until you just said, I can't do this anymore? That job can test you more than you can bear. Sometimes we have relationships, like we put our trust in a relationship that's the thing that's going to make us whole and well. And that relationship just gets worse and worse and worse until we say, I can't do this anymore. That means we've been tested more than we can bear. But it's not God doing the testing, right? It's that we've put our trust someplace else, and that someplace else will always ask for more from us, even if we have nothing left to give. So Paul isn't saying that, right? He's saying God won't test us in that way, but God does provide a way out. And this is where we also can get a little trapped, right? We can say, oh, I get it. If I put my trust in God, then I will never be tested beyond what I can bear. If I don't put my trust in God, then that's my fault, and I guess God will just let me go. Except for that's not how God works, because God is the God of steadfast love and mercy and forgiveness. And when we talk about the death and resurrection of Jesus, it's a story of God never giving up on us, even if we give up on God. Which brings us all back around again to texting while driving, right? We can text while we drive all we want. Sooner or later, that may land us in some pretty rough places. We can put our trust in all manner of things besides God, but that doesn't mean God has stopped trusting in us as humans. It's an odd thing that God works through us, right? Imperfect people as we are, and yet that's what God does to bring love and grace and mercy into the world. So no matter if we get our trust in the right place or the wrong place, God continues to show up again and again, and bad stuff keeps happening. And when that bad stuff keeps happening and we maybe feel like we're getting tested beyond the limits, Jesus keeps showing up and dragging us along and then sending us out so that when bad things are happening in the world and people feel like they're being tested, we can show up as that grace of God that helps them to find that way along as well, back into those places of feeling whole and well as we go. Amen.